Greetings everyone, Rejnols here, back at it again with some more Custodes content. Before we get started, I just want to quickly say thank you so much for 3,000 subscribers. It's been going quite fast recently. I do believe that at the start of the month, I was like at 2,800 subscribers. So I do really appreciate all of you subscribing and watching these videos, and yeah, I just hope I can continue to make some stuff that you want to see. In any case, today's video is all about the Adeptus Custodes Dreadnoughts. They haven't exactly been great in 10th edition so far, and today we're going to be talking about why that might be the case, and a few scenarios where you might be able to get some use out of them. So first of all, what changed between 9th edition and 10th edition for these Dreadnoughts? Well, the first thing to mention is that toughness across the board in the game went up, and that was also the case for Dreadnoughts. They went from toughness 7, which was basically like every vehicle except for super heavy vehicles, in 9th edition, and then in 10th edition they went up to toughness 9, which is more like your medium vehicle. Maybe not even medium vehicle, but like just below medium vehicle. In any case, toughness from 7 to 9 does change a little bit. Stuff like strength 4 weapons, such as the Space Marine bolters, or other strength 4 weapons, which I cannot remember any of right now, became a bit worse, because they now wound on 6s instead on 5s. But, I mean, yeah, bolters have a harder time shooting dreadnoughts, but bolters were already pretty much a useless weapon against anything except for absolute chaff units. So, yeah, the changes there. Does it really matter? Not really. It does also matter a little bit against melta weapons, because melta weapons were strength 8 in 9th edition, and they're strength 9 in 10th edition, which does mean that dreadnoughts are a little bit tougher against the new melta gun, which is not an anti-vehicle gun anymore, but more like an anti-elite infantry or like small vehicle monster gun. But, I mean, that's great, but no one really uses melta weapons anymore because, well, as I just said, they're just not good against big vehicles. So, despite it being slightly tougher for a melta gun to actually deal damage to a dreadnought, I mean, no one is bringing those melta guns anyway, except if it's a free option for your tank. And that's really all that the dreadnoughts gain. They did also gain some abilities. We'll get more into them as we speak about each individual dreadnought, but that's the biggest change in terms of what they gained, because they did lose quite a bit as well. First of all, -1 damage was a normal thing to be seen on almost all dreadnoughts, and that thing is just gone now. In addition, Custodes Dreadnought had a 6-up Feel No Pain. That is also gone. So while the toughness stat is up, our other defensive measures are down. And if you know anything about Warhammer, it is that damage as well as toughness is at its best when it's combined with additional things that give them more damage or more toughness. So a 6-up Feel No Pain by itself doesn't do a whole lot. -1 damage and a 6-up Feel No Pain starts doing something. Having high toughness, -1 damage, and a 6-up Feel No Pain, now we're cooking. Add in that we also had a 2-up save, as well as a 5-up invulnerable save for the Contemptor Dreadnought, as well as the Achilles Dreadnought, and we really had some quite tanky Dreadnoughts, which is also why they saw quite a bit of play towards the middle/end of 10th edition. However, all of that is gone, and that means that the only thing that Dreadnoughts gained is the toughness increase, as they kept their invulnerable save and armor save. Now, I suppose I could argue that this was needed because Dreadnoughts for Custodes might have been a little bit too tough, but at the same time, taking all of this away, as well as our next point, quite literally could have just killed the Dreadnoughts altogether, and that's why we don't see any play from them. And the last thing they lost, like across the board, was 3 inches of movement. And this is probably the biggest deal, because Custodes Dreadnoughts are focused on the melee game. Some of them can do shooting, in fact all of them can do shooting, but it was never their primary role. The shooting they had was nice, but it was meant to be a melee monster. And I personally quite like that. However, if they only took either the toughness or the movement away, I think Custodes Dreadnoughts would have been in a fine spot, but since they've taken both away, it is now harder to get to your targets, not only because you lost your movement, but also because you lost your durability. Dreadnoughts are fairly big boys. They cannot walk through walls, so you need to position them in a way where they can run in as straight as a line as possible to get to their target. Now, if they had the extra movement, maybe you'd be okay hiding behind a wall and then losing a little bit of movement to stay safe. Alternatively, if they hadn't lost their durability but had lost the movement, well, then you might be okay with putting them in the line of fire because they had a bigger chance of surviving it. With the loss of both of those things, they just kind of can't get anywhere without getting killed. And unfortunately, when they do get into combat, it's not like they're disappointingly bad. they just don't live up to all the other units in the codex. That is my general thoughts about why Dreadnoughts just don't work very well anymore. Let's now take a look at each individual Dreadnought, talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Starting us off, we have the Telmon Heavy Dreadnought. He is the big boy, I love him, such a cool model. And honestly, he might be the most viable Dreadnought for Custodes in the current metagame. The current metagame is extremely shooting focused. And the Telmon Dreadnought possibly has the best Devastating Wounds platform for Custodes. In fact, the only other Devastating Wound platforms you can get is the Palace Gravitank, the Corona's Grav Carrier, and once per game with the Sagittarum. However, all of those are either a little bit overcosted or their weapons aren't quite efficient enough. Whereas the Telmon with double storm cannons, well, I mean, it's 24 shots potential Devastating Wounds at AP 1, Strength 6. It's not completely horrible. It's not great, but it's not completely horrible. On top of that, it kept most of its stats from 9th edition. It went from Toughness 8 to Toughness 10, which means that certain anti-tank weapons will actually be wounding it on 4s instead of on 3s. It kept the 4-up invulnerable save, making it quite tanky. It has 8-inch movement. Now it is on quite a bit of a bigger base, so it's harder to hide, but you can actually push it up the board. It is -1 damage, helping that again, pushing up the board, surviving D damage. And yeah, in general, it can be quite tanky. However, while it is technically the best platform for Devastating Wounds in the Custodes Codex, it's still not great. I mean, with 24 shots hitting on 2s and then, looking for 6s, not that there's any rerolls available to the Dreadnought itself, on average you're looking at like 3 or 4 Devastating Wounds, which again is not terrible, it's just not amazing either. Then of course you have to put all the -1 damage 1 shots on top of it, and then you're probably dealing somewhere between 6 to 7 damage against a 3-up armor save, which again, is not terrible. The issue being, you have this big Dreadnought at 235 points, which, just barely kills maybe 2 or 3 normal Space Marines. Now you might ask yourself, well, how about if I go with a gun and a melee fist? Well, I mean, the melee isn't bad, it's just not great either. Strength 12, AP 2, damage 3. It'll kill some things, but the number of attacks you get with the Telmon Dreadnought is the same as you get with a single Custodian Guard, which is 5. And I probably don't need to tell you, but you have to kill an enormous amount of stuff. Or rather, an enormous amount of infantry models, which is what the Telmon is good at killing with that weapon profile, to make his points back. Because if you send him into a tank, on average, he's probably not going to kill it. And then there's also the issue of getting to the tank. Yes, he is fairly tough, but in the shooting meta that we're seeing right now, most tanks are just sitting at the other end of the battlefield, just shooting at him, while he's spending 2, maybe 3 turns getting there. And again, that is 235 points that are spending multiple turns before it's getting value back. I honestly think if you like the Telmon Dreadnought, there is a way to use him in your list efficiently, but he will never be quite as efficient as just spending those points on a Warden or a Guard Squad, and then investing a little bit more into them to make them even more efficient. Next up, we have the Galatus Dreadnought, which is probably... the Achilles is my favorite Dreadnought, but in terms of looks alone, I think the Galatus has him beat. Just super cool with the sword and the shield, and let's talk about him. So first of all, his heavy flamer on the sword got nerfed. Yes, it gained twin linked, but when you were using a flamer, you weren't really using it to look to wound something that's tougher. You were mostly using it to clear out a screen or take down a few models before you charge into something. And for that, I think on average 2d6 shots without twin linked is better than 1d6 shots with twin linked. So the heavy flamer, I haven't done the math, maybe I'm completely wrong, but on average I think it's a small loss in terms of shooting for the Galatus. The Galatus is fairly tanky, but mostly in melee. He does have a 4-up invuln because of his shield, just like the Telmon has. But in 9th edition, he used to be -1 to wound in melee and shooting, whereas he's only -1 to wound in melee now. Once again, this means that you need to get him into combat before he becomes, a true menace. And that's where we get to the issue. Yes, he has a 4-up invulnerable save, but he doesn't have -1 damage, he doesn't have his Feel No Pains. He only moves 6 inches instead of 9 inches, he cannot advance and charge. He just starts having a lot of issue getting into combat. Now, the Galatus is supposed to be the anti-infantry Dreadnought. He has a strength 9 weapon, a strength 8 weapon with 8 attacks. And obviously, in 10th edition, that's just not gonna kill a tank. But it is gonna kill, say, some Terminators. So I went ahead and did a little bit of math. The Galatus is 175 points, so the closest comparison I could get would be for Custodian Guards at 200 points. So, the Galatus, as I just mentioned, has 8 attacks at strength 8 versus 20 attacks at strength 7 from the Guardian Spears, sorry. They both get sustained hits, which means that when you're hitting on 2s, on average you're looking at 100% conversion. So if you start with 20 attacks, you end with 20 attacks. If you start with 8 attacks, you end with 20 attacks. That's math average, don't worry too much about it. So, again, anti-elite infantry is kind of what you want to get the Galatus into. So if we look at what the Galatus does into Terminators, which are toughness 5, 2 up save, 3 wounds, on average, the Galatus will kill 3 Terminators. On the other end, 4 Custodian Guards will kill 4 Terminators, and that is only when they're rerolling once to hit, and not the full wound reroll if they are controlling an objective. I just realized I didn't do the math if they have full rerolls, but we can probably say 5 or maybe even 6 Terminators die in that case. And that's a 25 point difference. Then also comes the fact that the Custodian Guard can run through walls, they can advance and shoot, they can be targeted by more stratagems than the Galatus Dreadnoughts, such as -1 damage, revive a model, +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles, in which case the Custodian Guards clearly become the better choice over the Galatus. You could also say that 4 Custodian Guards is a total of 12 wounds, with a 2 up save and a 4 up invulnerable save, but big damage, such as a last cannon, doesn't, spill over, which means that the last cannon is a lot more effective into the slower and less killy Galatus than it is against the Custodian Guard, who again is also easier to hide because they can run through walls because they're infantry. I'm really trying, but I just don't see anywhere where the Galatus at its current price cost compared to Custodian Guards have any value. Oh, did I forget to mention that all Custodian infantry has Deep Strike now, but the Dreadnoughts don't? So even if you're playing on, let's say, the most barren terrain board of all time, you could Rapid Ingress the Custodian Guard, move 6 in your turn, and then charge for a 3-inch charge against something because you start 9 inches away. Whereas the Galatus Dreadnought, you can Rapid Ingress him from strategic reserves, which means you're limited to board edges, which generally means that you're quite easily screened. And I think that rounds out my opinions on the Galatus Dreadnought. Unfortunately, this cool boy just doesn't stand a chance when compared to other stuff in the Custodes Index. Moving on to the Achilles Dreadnought. This guy was such a beast in 9th edition. I might even go ahead and call him the best. I do believe the Achilles and the Galatus was used roughly the same amount, but I think overall most people probably would say that the Achilles was the better choice. In any case, let's get started with what changed for the Achilles. First of all, his spear lost a lot of range. It went from range 24 to 12. It also now only has 1 shot instead of 2 shots. And in 9th edition, it was strength 8, so you could actually shoot it at basically anything and, have decent success. Whereas now, it's just strength 8 or 9, like it was before, but because the toughness increase, the shooting is only relevant into infantry or like medium, small vehicles and monsters. His arm gun options also saw some changes here and there. For example, the Twin Adratic Destructors, which used to be 2 shots each, is now 2 shots in total, but they're twin-linked. I think the Bolter is exactly the same, that might have also gotten twin-linked, and the Flamers also got twin-linked, but because he has 2 of them, it's actually 2d6 Flamer shots, which that's fine, it's okay. And between those 3 options, I would probably recommend that you take the Flamers right now, because having those Flamers for overwatching or clearing off chaff, it's pretty nice. What the Achilles have got going for it is it has a really good profile into anti-vehicles and monsters. Or not anti-vehicles and monsters. It has a good weapon against vehicles and monsters, which is why it's an anti-tank dreadnought. 5 attacks at strength 12 means that it will wound most things on freeze, but then you also have lance on top, so if you charge something, you're now wounding on 2s. You don't have any rerolls available to the Achilles, so if you do end up rolling a few 1s here and there, it will hurt a little bit, but you can get sustained hits. Now, for some reason, he's only AP2 in melee, which is a little bit weird to me. But oh well, AP2, D6 plus 1 damage. It's pretty decent into most tanks. If we do the math real quick with sustained hits, it would be 5 hits and then wounding on 2s because of lance with 5 attacks. That averages like 4.5 or 4.7 wounds. Let's just round it up to 5 wounds. Let's say we're against Magnus or Mortarion. They have a 2-up save, so they go to the 4-up invulnerable save. They'll save either 2 or 3 of them. And then on average, you'll deal 3 plus 1, so around 8 damage to those guys, which is not enough to kill them, but it is also only a 165 point model, that you're throwing into them. The issue for the Achilles is kind of the same issue that the Galatus has, but even worse, because the Galatus at least has a 4-up invulnerable save, but the Achilles only have a 5-up invulnerable save. He still only moves 6 inches, doesn't have the -1 damage like the Telmon, and doesn't have the 6-up feel no pain like they all had in 9th edition. And that just means that he needs to just advance up the board as soon as possible to get to something. And the things he wants to get into is usually also the things that kill him most efficiently, a tank or a monster. And because most tanks and monsters we're seeing at the moment is a shooting platform, that just means that you're basically saying, here is my 165 point model. Can you shoot him in 2 turns? Yes? Okay, I'll just remove him. And that's just the main problem. Most things that this guy wants to get into can just kill him. And of course, 5 attacks, strength 12 lance could be fine into melee as well, but the number of attacks at only 5 just means that on average you're just not gonna kill a whole lot. It's probably going to be like 2 or 3 Terminators on average, and there's even a chance that you fail to kill a Terminator, because if you roll the d6 and it's a 1, it'll only be 2 damage. So he's not really that great in melee either. He does have his mortal wounds on impact, but it's like, it's not good enough. And to top it all off, he went up like 10 points, or was it 15 points? Because he had that mortal wound thing, and after the data slate, GW was like, everything that can do mortal wounds must go up in price. Besides the fact that there are more units in the game that have a defense against mortal wounds than they have a defense against devastating wounds. I don't know. The more I think about that change, the dumber I feel. Overall, the Achilles is just a very cool model in a very wrong metagame. Finally, we have the oldest, but also the newest Dreadnought, I guess, because they got a new release in Horus Heresy, the Contemptor Dreadnought. Now, unfortunately, with the Index update, we didn't get access to all the other weapons that the Space Marine Contemptor Dreadnought have access to, so we still only have the choice of the Assault Cannon or the Melter Gun. Now, the Assault Cannon does have devastating wounds, but it's only like 6 shots. So on average, you're looking at like 1 mortal wound, which just completely means that it's not useful at all. And because Melta was so much fundamentally changed from 9th to 10th edition, where it just completely lost any target it wanted to be shot into, this guy just doesn't really do anything anymore. I mean, he used to be a really efficient shooting platform for Custodes in 9th edition because it was like 150 points for a multi-Melta and a fairly, decent melee profile, and then also being tough because of -1 damage, 6-up feel no pain, the invulnerable save, yada yada. But he lost all his toughness, he lost all his shooting, and while his melee is still fine, again, compare it to a guard squad, which is only 15 points more than this guy, and it's just not even close. Compared to the other Dreadnoughts, it's not specialized at anything. It doesn't have anti-tank shooting, it doesn't really have anti-tank melee or anti-infantry melee. So he's the most expensive Dreadnought with no specific role, with no specific good target, and he just kind of falls flat on the floor. Speaking of falling flat on the floor, there is one thing he got going for him. And that is that he might be the only Dreadnought, except for the Telmon, that can just rush up a flank and try and get into melee with something. Because his ability is on a 2+, he stands back up with d6 wounds at the end of the phase. So, you could, in theory, if you have turn 1, advance him up the board, put him in a spot where he will probably get killed, but then at the end of the shooting phase, when your opponent has emptied, whatever tank shots into him, you roll a 2-up and put him back up, and then hopefully your opponent doesn't have anything they want to put into melee with him. And then next turn, you can move 6 inches, and then maybe charge into something. But again, the issue becomes you charge into a tank, and then you deal, 6 damage at best. The opponent falls back with the tank, kills your Dreadnought, and that's it. And that, I think, rounds out my thoughts on the Contemptor Dreadnought, which means that it rounds out my thoughts on Dreadnoughts in Custodes, in 10th edition, in general. So, what can be done to bring Dreadnoughts up to a level where they can be used? Well, they really, most of all, need to be more comparable to the infantry options. Most Custodes Dreadnoughts are focused on melee. The exception here being a double gun Telmon, but even that one, I know a lot of people like to use 1 fist and 1 gun. However, as we've talked about, their output into their desired targets are either impossible because they just cannot get there, or the output is better for the infantry. Now you could probably reasonably just say, well, make dreads more cheap. Well, I mean, yeah, you could make dreads more cheap, but they're honestly already quite cheap for a Custodes unit. 165 points for an Achilles Dreadnought, 175 points for a Galatus, 235 points for a Telmon. It's not like they're that far off of infantry, and taking 5 points off them still won't be enough. So there has to be this fine balance between what they cost and what they output compared to custodians, or rather custodian infantry. And that's the fine balance spot where I have a hard time saying what should be done. I think on average, you could probably just say all dreadnoughts start at 7 attacks. And then you could have something like the Telmon, if it takes double fist, he gains either additional attacks or twin linked. And then the Galatus could get back his old ability of plus D3 attacks. This means that he will have more output than the other dreadnoughts, but not a crazy amount more output. Because all the other dreadnoughts will be 7 attacks base, he will be 8 attacks base plus D3, so on average 9 or 10 attacks. Then there's the issue about speed and toughness. We're only at the start of the edition, which means that we still have our codex around the corner. I think it would be fair to give either their toughness back or their speed. I think the more reasonable thing to do is give them their toughness back. I'm not saying they should have -1 damage and a 6-up feel no pain necessarily, but some kind of toughness increase. It could be, if the toughness goes to toughness 10 across the board and toughness 11 for the Dreadnought, or the Telmon, sorry. It could be they get the 6-up feel no pain back, but not the -1 damage, or vice versa. It could also be they don't get any of their toughness back and gets the speed back. However, the reason why I said I think it's more reasonable to give their toughness back is because GW have shown that they want to put a premium cost on fast units in 10th edition. Most units with a jetpack or something else are being quite aggressively cost. And I think if you gave them their speed back, then you need to compensate by making them more expensive. And then at that point, it's like, okay, they're fast now, but they're not tough anymore. So rather than have them walk towards the target and then get killed there, I'd rather probably just take my custodian guards that are, 5 points cheaper, or 5 points more expensive, but then can run through walls and stay in cover and stuff like that. And to top all of that off, another big issue is just the general shooting meta. Melee armies are seeing a combat, ironically enough, because Custodes got nerfed, but there is still so many lists that just takes an unhealthy amount of anti-tank shots, or have access to full rerolls, or automatic 6s, or whatever it may be, that will just pick off these dreadnoughts like it was nobody's business. And with that, I think we're done talking about custodian dreadnoughts. If you are someone who uses dreadnoughts in your list, feel free to share in the comments below what you've been doing, how they've been working out for you, and just your general thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video, and until I see you again, I hope you have a wonderful time.